Welcome to the Journey Podcast. Thanks so much for taking just a little bit of extra time out of your week this week to join us as we continue to learn together how hearing other people's stories helps us to live a better story ourselves. From a very early age, stories help form the way we think. Just by watching others around us and hearing the stories they tell, it informs us on what our ideals should be, what we should care about, or even what we should be fearful of. Today we're going to hear again from my pastor and friend Chad Current about some stories that impacted the way that he grew up and ultimately how it impacts his views today. Thanks so much for joining us. Welcome back to the Journey Podcast. My name is Eli, and once again, I am joined by my pastor and good friend, Chad Current. Welcome back.
Hey, Eli, thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So last time, we got to talk a little bit about the genesis, like the creation of this podcast, and what we were excited about with it. And we got to talk a little bit about stories and how they impact our own lives, and we talked a little bit about how hearing other stories can help us to live a better story ourselves. So today, what I wanted to talk about with you is I just wanted to hear about some stories that have impacted your life. And, you know, whether it's what led you down the road to becoming a pastor, or whether it's just stories in your family that have shaped your vision and view of how the world works, whatever it is, wherever we end up going with it, then cool. But I know for me, you know, obviously we've talked a lot about each other's personal lives and stories. I'm just looking forward into digging a little dirt into maybe what baby Chad was like.
Yeah, right.
You know?
Yeah. No, I love that when you were talking to me about this episode that you're like, you know, are there any stories, you know, I mean, you share, and I knew where you were coming. You were being really nice about it. Like, Chad, you tell stories every single Sunday. Dear Lord, we have to hear it. Is there anything possible that you could share that we haven't already heard?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm excited to share some stories that I've never shared. One in particular that I have never shared on a Sunday morning anywhere.
Oh, that's exciting.
Yeah. It's exciting. It's a little scary and because it's deeply personal, you know, in that way. Yeah.
Well, now I'm excited that we're even doing this because now I just want to hear the story out of curiosity at this point. So I'm excited to hear along with everybody else. So yeah, I think a good place for me, in my mind, for us to start is when you were young, because a lot of information that we take in at a very young age. Right. You know, just watching. I mean, so much of what forms us as people, you know, you see kids and you say, oh my gosh, so-and-so acts just like their mom. That's like a little mini, you know, whoever. And it's based on watching. So much of what we do is just observing the world around us and observing those that we trust or, quite frankly, don't trust. And just watching those things that make us feel safe or unsafe or whatever that may be. So I would be really interested to hear when you were young, maybe what is one of the first examples you can think of about a story that changed your perspective, maybe even to the point to where it altered the way you feel about or lived your own story, maybe even now.
Yeah, so the first person that comes to mind that I've always said she taught me how to tell stories and was the great storyteller of our family was my grandma, Nancy Current. And so when we would have family gatherings, especially when her sisters were all still alive and they would get together and have us all together as family, first of all, we'd always have great food, amazing cooks, and then and then after we were done eating, one of the things that I loved to do, even as a little child, was to sit around and listen to the stories that Grandma and her sisters and the family would tell. And in those stories, I found, looking back, my identity began to be shaped because I heard about how my great-grandpa came from Italy. And if you go to Ellis Island, you can see his name, Joseph Landreau, on the books there. And then
Wow, that's some history right there.
Yeah,
That's a lot.
I love that stuff.
Yeah,
I eat that up. Yeah,
I remember I know you love that because I remember before I even worked here, the very first thing you had me do is you took me on a history tour of Maysville.
Right.
And so I know that's probably right up your alley.
Yeah, so I love that. And then she talked about him coming here and then he ended up marrying my great grandma when he was 50 and she was 16.
Oh.
And yeah, that's uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's how long ago was this?
Oh gosh, so my goodness, how he would be. Man, he died when he was 98, and that was before I was born in 1974. So
oh wow, so it was 1800s.
1800s.
Wow,
yeah. So different time, different setting, but still not bad. Okay.
Yeah,
In fact, the story I later heard was my grandma talking about how basically her grandma sold her mom to my great grandpa in a sense. Now they wouldn't call it that, but
sure.
Basically that's what it was. Today we'd probably look at that as something like human trafficking.
Yeah.
But to my great grandma's credit, she came to have a love and adoration for my great grandpa, so the stories go. But in those stories and hearing the story, our family, that part of my family, very poor, very oppressed. There was a lot of I remember hearing my grandma share stories of racism against she and her sisters for being half Italian and the certain name that they were called. And but in all of those stories, we in every one of them, what I loved about it is because in our family, we became the hero of our own stories. Whether it was and I told him, or we had nothing and we got here, and it was that was a big deal. We're children of an immigrant who came here literally with nothing but what he could carry, and he had to start over. And now we're here, and we didn't. And by that time, we had not made it far in our family, but we were still better than what we were a generation ago. And so. In all of that, I began to have a sense of identity. So I'd say that's those stories that Grandma told and her sisters, and listening to those stories began to help me see who I was,
Sure.
And in that, it also helped me as I got older see some of the reasons for our family struggles. At first, I just loved the stories. Then you get a little older and you look at it and you say, I think about the time my grandma said how the last conversation she ever had with her grandma and grandpa was the day that her grandpa put a gun in my grandpa's face, my grandma's husband, and said, he threatened to kill him. And my grandpa, who was just this great, quiet man, he never told stories. I learned everything from him, from Grandma.
Yeah.
He ended up looking him back in the eye, and Grandma said, Chad, you know what your grandpa said to him? I'm like, no. He said, if you're going to shoot me, you better not miss, because if you do, I'll take that gun and I'll blast it. I'm sure
like
and I know Grandpa had very colorful language, so I'm sure it was filled with a lot of things Grandma didn't let me hear.
Sure.
But again, identity. There's strength, there's courage, there's overcoming and all that. And so I'd say that's the first positive example of how a story shaped my story.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm going to be honest, those are two really wild. Just even that, just the two that you told in that time are very, very interesting to me, at least.
You can understand me a little better now, can't you?
Yeah. That's. To be honest, I don't quite know what to say about your grandpa being. Apparently, he's like Old West gunslinger.
That's right.
I'm coming back for you. No, that's funny. But no, you're right. I mean, it helps us to develop a sense of self. It helps us to develop a sense of, especially at that young of an age.
Right.
You hear about someone being steadfast in your family. It helps you develop the thought that, okay, like that's who my family is. That's who I need to be.
Yeah.
You hear about someone being bold. Okay, that's who our family is. That's who I need to be.
Yeah.
Or the opposite side of that, you hear about someone being afraid of something. Oh, I should be afraid of that thing.
Right.
And it helps us. And so that's why filtering the stories we hear is so important, and putting them through, a biblical lens or a trusted lens or whatever that may be is so vital and pivotal as well. So continuing throughout Chad's life, still young Chad, but maybe a little bit older, a little more understanding of the world. How about that time frame? You started school, you're doing, you're becoming who you are. What's another story that maybe in your teenage years or early or late preteen years or whatever that may be, that helped you, that maybe not helped you, but that is vivid and sticks out in your mind is important?
Right. And so this is the story that I've never told.
Mm-hmm.
And I say this that, and I think anyone who shares a story about their parents that doesn't paint their parents immediately in a good light, if you love them, you want to try to
for sure
put a parentheses around it and explain it. But hopefully by the time I'm done, you'll see everybody will be okay. But I can remember it was preteen age, and I remember my mom coming into my room where I had been sent. I was punished for something. I don't remember what I had done or said or what happened. I don't remember any of the circumstances. But I remember it felt very much like many other times. And I was in my room, and I was sulking,
Sure.
And I hear a knock on my door. It's my mom. And I remember thinking to myself, she's going to apologize to me, which, to my mom and dad's credit, they always modeled that for me. That it was not only okay, but it was the right thing to do, was to apologize when you're wrong. So that's honorable in itself. So she comes in, but I remember, and then she apologized, and then she threw her arms around me. And I remember something happened inside of me, and it felt really good at the time. And that was, I didn't hug her back, and I kept my arms to my side. And inside I said to myself, you've said you're sorry before, and you've done it again. And I don't have to feel bad for it.
Wow.
And I feel good not feeling anything. And that day I learned how to shut my feelings down.
It was an incredibly dark place to be for a preteen.
It was.
That's hard.
But it felt very empowering.
Sure.
And for a long time, I lived my life thinking that I was strong when I could shut out feelings that I didn't want to feel. I still struggle with that today, and I've dealt with this through therapy and so forth. It's one of those things where what you think is a positive thing that protects you ends up hurting you later in life.
Sure.
And that certainly was the case for me in many of my relationships.
Yeah.
But the reason I share that story, it was because you fast forward a couple years past that into my teenage years. And one day, and I don't even know how it came up or why it would come up.
Sure.
But it seemed to Mom the right time to really share her story.
Yeah.
And it was at that point, and I knew enough about it to I had pieces of things, you know what I mean, how you do?
Yeah.
And I think that's why it's important, by the way, to say to our kids the real story.
Yeah.
Because if you don't, we're going to put the pieces together, right or wrong, healthy or unhealthy.
Yeah.
And so she put the pieces together to me. And it wasn't about justifying or anything like that, but she just told her story in an age-appropriate way, which was basically, her mom, and I've shared this before, my grandma had 5 different husbands, always needing a man in her life, but always picking the man that was like the one you didn't want or need in your life, or especially your children's lives. And many of those men opened the door to my mom being very violently sexually abused and verbally abused, and just things that today would very quickly have a child removed from a home, but back then, in a different day and different time, things were dealt with in a different way, I suppose.
Sure.
And I remember when she shared that, I'm going to be a little... But I remember her sharing that, and it was like, that was the first day that I began to understand my mom and feel like I had permission to actually love her.
Sure.
Because for the first time, those things that I said, well, you've said you're sorry before and you did it again, whatever that was, because I honestly don't remember. It wasn't an excuse for her, but it was like I understood.
Yeah. And
that has really shaped me in my understanding of Scripture and in ministry with people, is that it is, the Bible says that man looks at the outward appearance, God looks at the heart. And I think that's the day that I really learned that. And when I hear other people and I see what's wrong in their lives, it's so glaringly wrong. It's not a time hardly that goes by when God doesn't check me and say, hey, remember your mom?
Yeah.
Because there was a whole lot in her story that you had no idea, but once you understood it, you understood her.
Yeah.
You could love her. You could accept her. You could allow her in, and you didn't have to be the strong little boy anymore who shut her out. You could open the door to the good while closing the door to what wasn't healthy.
Sure.
And so that was a story. So all that together is a story that really continues to shape me today.
Yeah. And that's so, it's so interesting because a lot of times we don't have the full story. With just about very little do we actually have the full story.
Right.
I mean, something that I've always appreciated about you that you've always said is it's not up to us what God's working on in someone.
Right.
Like it's not up to me. And so someone could be going through something that I have no idea, and God is dealing with that in them and shaping them and molding them. And like you said, it doesn't mean it's okay. But man, once we get to hear that and once we get to say and see, God is doing this work in them, then it can make sense.
Yeah.
And then we can compartmentalize it. And then we can say, okay, that's not okay, but I can accept that and we can move on because I see what God is doing in me. And I think that hopefully is the goal, is understanding. Is the goal is not to passively sit by and, sulk and to say, I'm going to shut down and I'm going to shut off. But the goal, hopefully, as we are going on our journey and as we are living our own story, is to pursue understanding and to pursue grace and being a peacemaker, in whatever form it needs to take.
I think it's a great point, Eli. I think that when we are willing to, and it's a beautiful, but it can be a dangerous thing for a lot of people, that when we're willing to hear each other's stories, then all of a sudden people become people to us.
Yes.
And they're no longer just, well, he's a jerk, or she's so judgmental, or whatever it is that we attach to someone. Once we hear their story, then we understand what's going on behind that assumption.
Well, it allows
this black
empathy.
and white assumption we made. Yeah,
it allows empathy to step in, because then once we hear the story, we can put ourselves in their shoes.
Right.
And we can, and hopefully once we try and operate in that understanding, we don't have to it's the unknown where the frustration lies. Yeah. It's the confusion where the frustration lies. And so once we can take the time and do our due diligence, and I think the hard thing is that doesn't always come to pass.
Right.
You don't always get understanding.
Sure.
And that's where I like to think grace has to come in, and you which again is very easy to sit here on this couch and say, that's why we should have grace. And, obviously it's way harder in the situation, and I'm not always good at it. I know, no one is perfect at it, but if we can at least pursue understanding and pursue the way that God pursues us and gives us grace.
Right.
He lays the template, he lays the groundwork, he lays the foundation for us. Right. And then we have the choice to see that and replicate it, or to see that and say, no, I think I'm good.
Right.
And hopefully we choose to recreate what's already been modeled for us in a pretty blatant way.
Right.
So as we continue with the theme of stories, we shift further in life now. Now you are, you have life experience. You've been able to form yourself as a person. And we never stop forming. We never, you can be 90 years old and still learning. What is an example of maybe a time in your adult life? Or is there a place that you feel like you've been able to learn more as once you've become who you are, once you've grown in that way?
It's funny. This isn't something that I had planned to talk about, but I remember when I was in seminary, and we had two professors, Dr. Weigelt and Dr. Freeborn, and these two had kind of, in their story, had both extremely intelligent men, really kind of head first in their faith, which is something to be very respected. I'm not putting that down. They thought very carefully about their faith and helped others think about their faith. But they came to this realization where spiritual formation really happens when we allow God into and become a part of His story. And one of the exercises they had us do as freshmen in seminary was they had us go back and say, where was a high up to this point in your life? And so I was like 20, 21, 22, something like that. 23. I don't know how old I was. I'm horrible with dates and times.
That's okay.
And math.
That's all right.
But anyhow, I was young, early 20s. What's a high point and what's a low point? And it was really interesting that my high point and my low point were at the same time. In my teenage years, I hated school. I was extremely shy. I had no friends. And it was a miserable time in a lot of ways of life. And then at the same time was when I experienced God calling me into ministry. And so I had this really low point, but this really high point, which I didn't want to accept. And then there was these people in my life, like my Sunday school teacher, Molly Craddock, probably the most influential, and my pastor at the time, who kept inviting me and calling me out of the story I had created, where it was, Chad's nobody, he has no friends, just hide in the background and don't be seen, to Chad, it's okay for you to step into what God's calling you to.
Sure.
And they did that by sharing their own story.
Yeah.
And then getting me, pulling me out of my shell and getting me to share my story. And so, that's something that comes to mind as you ask that question. That really began to kind of shape me for my future calling and so forth.
Operating in that calling, and knowing that you were headed towards being a pastor and headed,
right.
That really informs your future. So now here you are, present day,
right.
Chad. You've lived,
right.
half a life of stories. You have a ton of experiences on your own, a wife and kids, and you've been pastoring at Crosspoint for a while, and you pastored at other places before this.
Right.
How has we kind of shift gears to the first half of the phrase you said is hearing stories, and
Right.
so we've talked about you hearing stories. Now let's shift our focus to the second half of helps us to live a better story.
Right.
So how, in your purview, how has hearing stories changed the story that you've lived up to this point? How has it helped you to live a better story?
Sure. So, going back to grandma and her sisters sharing stories around a meal, stories have shaped my identity, helped me know who I am, who I want to be.
Yeah.
They shape values, what do we value, what don't I value, what's a priority, what's not a priority. So that's definitely had an impact. I think about the story I told about my mom and all of that it has shaped my kind of my perception of others. Like definitely. I now, ever since I've heard that story, her story, it helped me. It's like I have this, it's given me a lens to wear on my good days. And some days I'm just a jerk.
Sure.
But on my good days.
Not sure like that. That sounded like I was
Yeah, no, it's okay to say it. You're like, sure, I work with him. I know.
No.
But on my good days, I'm able to say, wait a minute. There has to be more to their story than that.
Definitely.
Like, I'm seeing, the tip of the iceberg, and there's so much more under the water of that story. And then you begin to learn somebody's story, and you're like, oh my gosh, had I been through that, had I experienced that, had I had heard that at that time of life, how would that have set my story in a different direction?
Yeah.
And so I think that has been something that is just a part of me and really shaped, and hopefully people can hear that. Knowing that story, they can hear it in my preaching, they can hear it in what we do as a church family, especially with our idea of being for everyone.
Definitely.
And I think that's part of the reason I was so drawn to Crosspoint, was that vision of because for me, the stories that have shaped my life, it says that's the only way I believe, to live out what it means to be passionate followers of Jesus, that has been willing to understand that until we know someone's story, we really don't know them.
Yeah.
You know? And once we know their story, even if we totally disagree with each other,
Yeah.
we can at least understand each other.
Absolutely.
You know? And so that's been a part of it. And then I just think of people who have influenced me in ministry, people who have influenced me as a dad, as a husband. It's all, I mean, I just have story after story right now, and people, faces of people coming to mind who, just hearing their stories, have shaped the way that I interact with others and live. And I think the powerful thing about it is that, you know, yeah, I'm 49 years old, but if I get to live I was reading a book when I was going through cancer that said, put an expiration date on you. When's your expiration? So I picked 98. I figure I want to live to 98 so everybody can say, daggone, he was so close to 100. And I can say, no, didn't do it. But at the same time, I feel like so 98, close. That's a pretty good...
That's a very long life.
That's a long life, you know? Like, that's a whole nother lifetime for me at this point.
Yeah.
But even if I get to live till I'm 98, I think that's the powerful thing about stories is, if you allow them, they'll continue to shape you and change you and change your view of others and the world and even of God till the day you die.
Yeah.
You know? And
absolutely.
And it doesn't matter what, you know, where you are in life or what age or what your health is, those stories can continue to have an impact.
Absolutely. Well, and I think, you know, we are the culmination of our experiences. Mm-hmm. You know, and part of our experiences is hearing other people's stories.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so, you know I'm sure I'll probably have you on here again, tell a little more about your story and who you are.
Oh, my word, no. I do get to talk about my stories enough. This will be it, we promise you. The rest of it will be other people, and which I really am excited about.
I am too.
Hearing other people's stories in a way that is more in depth than we have time for or can do
on a Sunday
morning.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
yeah.
And this different format allows us to do that, and I think that will be surprisingly transformational.
I agree.
Not just in individuals who listen, but I think for our faith community, and hopefully, if you're not a part of our church, it spills over into other faith communities as well.
Yeah, I am in total agreement, and I just want to say thank you for, you know, being a part of this. And I know, you know, as I was sitting there deliberating, you know, who may be the best to bring on, you may not agree with me, but I thought can't think of anybody I'd rather do the first one with than Chad, and so I'm just glad you decided to do this with me.
Yeah, I'm really appreciative that you are leading us down this path as a church family, and I think I'm excited to see what comes of it. So thanks for taking on the extra work and time to do it.
Hey, happy to do it.
So who's next? Yeah,
and anybody who is out there listening, thank you for listening to the second episode of the Journey podcast, and we're looking forward to the next one where we will be hearing some stories about life change so that we can live a better story ourselves. See you guys next time.